Hi everybody. At this point, we're going to do a stitching tutorial to just show you how to actually sew your pegboard. So this is the finished example that we're going to work towards. This includes 4 different types of yarn or type methods for stitching your pegboards. And that will include sewing with yarn that's this width, and we're going to do that doubled over. We're going to use a thicker yarn, something more like this, and this is a single strand stitch. And then we're also going to learn 2 methods for attaching beads. Some of the kits have beads in them. So in your kit, you started out with something that looked like this, just a plain board with different types of lines. The key for these obviously is for the thicker lines tell you where to paint different colors, and the thinner lines are just reminders for where your stitches go. So when you're painting, this is an example that just has 1 coat of paint. Notice that it's a little bit uneven, so just be aware that if you don't like this appearance as much, then I would suggest just adding a 2nd coat of paint. You want to make sure that the paint is totally dry when you're starting to sew, and we're ready to do that. So while we're doing this tutorial, feel free to pause the video at any time if you need, or go back and rewind. I'm going to start with this green yarn. So when you're threading your yarn needle, I suggest holding the yarn pretty close to the end and just pushing it through the eye. Pull the yarn through. We're going to double this over. So even though we're just going to be doing one stitch here, the yarn will be twice as thick, and that is part of that is just so that it can help cover up some of the paint lines, so it's a little bit forgiving. So if your lines aren't perfect, the stitching will help kind of cover them up, and the yarn actually adds its awesome texture. So I'm going to start in this corner here, and when I choose like where to place my first stitch, what I want to make sure is that I'm starting from behind the pegboard. So I'm pulling my needle through, and then for the very first stitch, this one is a little bit different than your other stitches, just because, whoops, let me pull this out. Okay, so this is actually a good thing to show. Just try to make sure you're in control of where your yarn and your needle are. Okay, the first stitch though, this knot is not big enough to secure the yarn in this place, which is what we want. So in order to accomplish that, I've just tied a little knot, and now, okay, the needle can go through, it goes in between the strands, and we can pull this tightly. And when it's at this point, the yarn is not coming out. So I can now sew, and my yarn is secure. That's what we want. Okay. Something else that we need to understand about sewing is that for this method, we're skipping a space, we're skipping stitches. So also the reason for that is because, wait, let me pull this through and I'll show you. So if I am sewing here and I want to make this stitch next, what's going to happen if I put my needle here is that, oh, it's going to actually undo that one that I just made. So we avoid that by, I've skipped this stitch, and now I'm actually going to go backwards. So I'm starting on the opposite side, and I'm going to finish this line, yeah, just by skipping backwards and filling in spaces. So I'm going to do this, and there we go. So just to show this part, if I am doing the zigzag, this is a little bit of a different pattern. It's not just in a straight line, but I can still tell, oh, if I'm doing this stitch next, I can't start from here. So I'm actually going to do this stitch second. Okay, so I'm going to move down to this space. Okay, the yarn goes in, and all right, now I've got these 2 that are parallel, and I can come into this hole and make this stitch, and my yarn is secure. Okay, so that is that. I'm going to stop here, but I do want to show you quickly how to do these type of pony beads. So you can see in the position on the example that these pony beads are on top of the holes. So what I want to make sure is that the first one that I place is not gonna, I'm not gonna undo any stitches, and I'm gonna start again like normal. Okay, pulling the yarn up from the bottom. I'm gonna just take a bead, putting it on, threading it all the way, put it all the way down. And then your needle goes back into the same hole that you started from. Okay, so if I want to show that again, if I'm putting a bead here, I would just do that, come up through the hole, put the bead on, and because it's not moving, the yarn just goes back in here. Okay, so just pretend that this is finished. I want to be aware of people's time, so I'm not going to finish stitching this green, but understand that in the example, like if I was finishing this, then yeah, obviously I would continue that. We need to take a minute to talk about what's going to happen if you need to change colors of the yarn, or if you get to the end of the length and you can't sew anymore, you need to attach more yarn. So this is for when you're transitioning or when you need to reload your needle. Okay, so I normally just cut a little end like this, and then I will pull one of these tails underneath some nearby yarn. Can be, you know, whatever. Again, this just having it underneath that other stitch will make this secure. And I'm gonna tie a double knot. So one, that's not enough. I'm gonna need to tie two. And then this will just, it makes your yarn, it stays there, okay? If you have a little bit of an extra length like that, you might wanna trim it so that it's shorter. So once you have a double knot, make sure you're not gonna see your yarn sticking out at the front, and then we're good to go. Let's look at this white yarn, which is thicker. So for this yarn, I only need one width. So for this method, we threaded the needle and we doubled the yarn over. We don't need to do that now. What we're gonna do is just put the yarn into the eye of the needle, pull this through, and okay. So let's take a look at stitching this waterfall. I'm gonna start again at the top, and for this type of stitching, in a similar way, I didn't even cut these, whoops. Okay, so let's say we're good on that. When you get down to here, I would say just tie this into a double knot. And in order to do that, this is like the same way that you would double knot your shoes. Okay, tie, and all right. Again, I'm gonna just trim this extra because I don't need it, and we can start sewing. So I've got my first stitch, it's secured with a knot, and let's start sewing. Because I'm just doing, or I just have the one strand of yarn here. It's pretty much the same thing though, as far as like where you're placing your stitches. You're gonna skip a space, and then when I get down here, I'm gonna go backwards to finish this line. All right, so let's do that. Let's do this. I want to say that I'm holding the board with one of my hands so that it's easy for my sewing hand to like reach behind. It's helpful to have access to the front and the back. Okay, let's say we are done. We're gonna stop on stitching with the single yarn, the single strand. So again, what I'll do is I will cut this so that it's a little, shorter, it's more manageable. And I will wrap it underneath a nearby strand of yarn, and we can just sort of pull this through here and make a knot. Let's see. Okay, so that is fine. Gonna trim that. There you go. Okay. Let's look at the bottom. What I need to do now is let's talk about putting the pony beads in where they're floating. So that means they can move. They're just somewhere in the middle spaces here. Let me see. So what I need to do is to I'm gonna take the yarn off the needle. I'm gonna get my next color, and we're gonna do the same method as with the green yarn. So I'm threading the needle. I'm gonna double the yarn over because it's a thinner strand, so we wanna have extra thickness. Tie this into a knot. My needle is in the middle, and let's say we wanna start on the edge, right? This is coming in. Before we pull it all the way out though, it goes back through the bottom. Oh, and now that I say that, I'm messing up. Excuse me. Okay. This, I need to remember to put the bead on. Okay, because it's floating, I need to actually like put the bead on while I'm stitching. So it comes in, or goes out, the bead goes on, and in this case, I have the bead and the yarn on the same stitch. So I'm still tying my knot, but before I can do this, I just want to make sure that this bead is attached. Okay, so even though we are attaching beads, we're still gonna sew like this. So I'm gonna skip a space, attach the bead here while, before I'm finished with the stitch, and then, and you wanna make sure that my yarns are even. Okay, we can go backwards. Again, I wanna make sure that my stitch is not gonna come undone, the one that I've just placed. And we'll put this here, and here we go. All right. Okay, so while you're working, what you'll probably find is that it gets a little bit easier as you continue, as you progress, and that is great. I think sewing skills, it can be a nice way to relax a little bit. And what I just like to say is to remember that you're doing about half of it in the first go round, and you're doing the other half like kind of in the opposite direction. So don't be, it might feel a little bit funny because you're not drawing lines like normal, like if you had a pencil or a pen. But eventually you're building the whole image at one time, and or kind of in chunks, and that's just part of the process. So I hope that you enjoy, and when you're finished, I wanted to talk about how to display these. So let's say I have completed a design that I really like, and I want to put it on display. One option can be to just sort of put it up like how you would display like a dish, so kind of in a small holder on the bottom, prop it up against a wall, prop it up against something. You can try attaching some kind of a bracket on the back. One thing that I found when I was putting this on is that even though the screws were really thin, or they're pretty small, I found that they were still just a little bit too thick for the board. So this is the thickness of the screw, and this is the thickness of the board. So when you're putting these together, you want to just make sure that, oh, this is not gonna push through. So this one is honestly, it's on, it's a little bit loose. To me, it's still not gonna move really vertically, so I would still put a nail in and just put that in. I have also hung these on the wall just by putting two nails in through corners, especially if you have like a smaller nail or thinner. You can just put it through two. You do need to do 2 holes though, because these have even numbers, so you want them to be level. Let's see. I think there's one other thing I was gonna say, but I'm forgetting it, so I think I will sign off and say, all right, enjoy your sewing.